Good morning, everybody. I would like to ask us to start today by doing something together. I want to ask each of us to think of a moment in your life. It's a specific moment. And hopefully, at least everyone in this room has had this moment once or more in your life. It's that moment when you feel yourself falling in love with somebody. You know that beginning in a relationship where there's the excitement, the uncertainty, the attraction, you feel your heart beating faster, they're filling your thoughts, everything that they do is perfect. You haven't had all those mornings waking up together yet, and when you do, they're still incredibly excited. Are you thinking about that? And you can have that feeling in different things. You can have that feeling in relationships when you're falling in love. You can have that feeling when you become a parent and you bring your child home and you look in her or his eyes. I don't mean 3 months in when you're waking up at 3 in the morning and ready to lose the hair that you once had. But just that moment that takes your breath away, that moment when you are working passionately with total focus on something that you love and you are experiencing and finding yourself, you're being in that moment. And the reason I'm asking you to think about these moments and to hopefully hold some of them inside for yourself is, in a way, that is symmetry. That's an experience of symmetry. There's different ways of understanding symmetry, and I'm going to try and look at a few of them, but I should begin by saying I am not a physicist. And when Stefania asked me to speak about symmetry, and I began over the last weeks to think more about it, to wonder what am I going to say, how am I going to approach this, how I'm going to connect it to our lives, I began to have to dive more and more into an area that I love and that I'm passionate about, physics. But what it made me realize is I wish I had years to prepare for these 20 minutes. And I don't know if this is appropriate to say, especially since it's on film, but when Stefania said this morning, because I was telling her how incredibly exciting it was and how much I was getting into it over the last weeks. I was preparing a publication on stabilization and how to prevent war in Sudan. I was working with colleagues in northeast Nigeria on how to prevent violence around the upcoming elections. I was supporting an incredible colleague in the work she was doing to put together a program and a project on providing support for migrants and refugees. And in between that very light load, I was trying to find seconds and moments to be reading, watching videos about symmetry. And more ideas were coming. And then Stefania wonderfully says this morning, and remember, you have 20 minutes. And I said, telling someone that they have 20 minutes to talk about symmetry is like saying you only have 20 minutes to make love. It's just wrong. So I am not going to be able to cover everything. I'm going to cover some, but what I hope is that through these 20 minutes, we begin to experience some of the extraordinary beauty of the understanding of symmetry and to think about how it connects with our own lives. And that was part of the thinking, the thought behind the question of what is the symmetry in your life? So shall we dive in? Yep. All right. Great, this was supposed to be up there because the theme of Creative Mornings, we're waking up, we're trying to find that nice feeling, we're trying to get inspired, and who doesn't love a beautiful picture of a starfish on a beach where on a cold, wintry day in Cluj we might wish we are. Symmetry is all around us. It is experienced and expressed through many different forms of human action and creativity and all around us in the natural world. We look for it, we find it in buildings, in photography, architecture, design, the Hadron Collider, nature. And this fits with one of our basic, our colloquial understandings of symmetry. The idea of symmetries of scale or fractal symmetry, that as you replicate or go into something larger or smaller, it replicates the same form. Again, in architecture, Taj Mahal, one of the most famous examples. And one of the areas where we see symmetry just explored from so many different angles is in Islamic art, because they were forbidden to create and to reproduce something with a soul. And so if you go to the Alhambra, or if you go to some of the different great centers of Islamic art around the world, you see many different expressions and manifestations or examples of symmetry. And again, in nature. This is one of the examples, if you watch videos of symmetry given by physicists trying to help people like me understand what they're speaking about. One of the examples that they love to give is the honeycomb. And the honeycomb follows the law of energy. It's one of the basic fundaments in nature, how to come up with the most efficient forms. Why are honeycombs hexagons? Does anyone have an idea? Please.
What's the greatest structure for...
It's the most efficient structure. One, there are only 3 shapes with equal sides that you can reproduce that fit together perfectly. Square, triangle, hexagon. Of these, the hexagon has the least perimeter while providing the greatest amount of space. It means it uses the least beeswax while giving the most space in which to put something. Well, why does the shape have to be the same? Because if you're building it with different shapes, then every bee would have to wait for the previous bee to finish what it's building, and then would have to try and fit around it, and that would take a long time. Bees have evolved. They have found this perfect form that they need in order to all be able to create it harmoniously together, using the least amount of beeswax, least amount of energy to create the greatest opportunity, to create the greatest synergy in their activity. Music. Part of what's beautiful in music is you have this constant interplay of symmetry and asymmetry. Even in pottery, you can have vertical asymmetry, but you need horizontal symmetry as you're welding and making the pottery and the act of creation. And then you can go back to religious symbols, artistic expressions, Celtic symbols. From a distance, this is part of the interesting idea of symmetry and asymmetry, from a distance, even planets appear to be perfectly symmetrical. But again, as you get closer to them, then what you see is asymmetry. You notice nuance, variation. And this is a core element of the concept, because as humans have developed our concept, our ideas, our mathematical principles and principles in physics and chemistry of symmetry, there everything is perfect. But in real life, at least when you come to forms and objects, symmetry is always imperfect. The closer in you go, eventually at one point you discover a difference. I actually wouldn't call that imperfection. Maybe that is what makes it perfect. That nuance and diversity. So this is where I started at, before all the beautiful pictures. This is what I started with, what most of us start with in our understanding of symmetry. Basically expressed thinking that it means something's the same. If you reflect it, if you shift it, it will appear the same. So here you can see what is symmetric. If we take this side of the tree, we flip it over the vertical line, it has the same proportions on the other side. Here it's asymmetric. It doesn't replicate or hold constant the form. That's the basic understanding that most of us, once you go through elementary school, come away with about symmetry. And one of the stories, at least that I grew up with learning about, was the snowflake. Have you heard the story of the perfect snowflake? Every snowflake is unique, and every snowflake is an example of a fractal. If you take 1/6 or 1/12 of a part of a snowflake, you can understand and reproduce its entire form. This is something that we find often in nature. And this is part of a concept of deep symmetry. These are some of the different examples of basic understandings of symmetry. Translational symmetry means if you move something along a horizontal line, it will hold the same form and proportions. Reflectional symmetry, that's like the tree. You put a line down the middle, but the other side will still reflect and hold the same quantities and proportions. Rotational symmetry, there's a great video. I'm going to share lots and lots and lots of videos with everyone after. There's a great video where this man, he's a mathematician, he's a scientist, he's a father. He takes his children on these wonderful visits of different locations where they can learn about symmetry. You see a picture of his son in the video. He doesn't look so excited. But what he's doing is taking all of these different images and taking it out, rotating it, putting it back, and showing how it remains exactly the same. That's part of the concept of rotational symmetry, and there's different forms. And then glide symmetry, moving reflection and along a horizontal line. You also find symmetry in chemistry. It's the foundation of many of the fundamental understandings that we have developed and laws within chemistry and different types of symmetry. And in space. And this is where you have to show the picture of Einstein, one of the most incredible, innovative, and brilliant thinkers. And part of what Einstein helped us to understand is the symmetry of time-space, or space-time. And what's interesting was up until Einstein, those concepts had always been considered separate. It was Einstein that brought them together for the first time. And some of the ways of explaining what he basically was thinking through this, I mean, there's the story of Einstein and the bicycle and the shooting star, which was part of the thinking in his mind. But for example, if you have an experiment that is being carried out in a laboratory, and you have one laboratory which is stable, which is in a fixed location, and another laboratory is moving, traveling through space and time, the experiment that is being carried out in that laboratory will remain constant. And this is the core idea of symmetry underlying the laws of nature and the laws of physics. That no matter where you shift the location, or if it is moving in space and time, you're able to reproduce the same constants. So if you're carrying out an experiment in Cluj, in Johannesburg, in Tokyo, in New York, or Oslo, if you're carrying it out according to the same practices, the same standards, then you will replicate and have the same results. And another aspect, when we get to looking at the advanced fields of physics today, and when we're looking at our universe and trying to use the understandings of symmetry to understand the universe, one of the things that we've seen is that the universe, at least according to our current theories, is constantly expanding. What's interesting about that is no matter where you are in the universe, it appears to be expanding outwards from you. So from any single point in the universe, there is a symmetry of your experience of the expansion of existence, of the universe. And a simple way of thinking about that, and again, the example that's often given is, imagine you're in a balloon. You can be standing on any point of the balloon. The point where you are standing, you experience as fixed, constant. And everything else is expanding out from you. This is an area of theoretical physics that's beginning to be tested, but it's the idea of supersymmetry. What this postulates is that for every particle that we know of in the known universe, there's a shadow particle, a superparticle, which corresponds to it. We have no proof that this exists yet, but that's one of the things that the Hadron Collider, the Large Hadron Collider, is trying to discover and to explore. And this reminded me, this took me back to a book I read years ago, and it's part of the theme of this conversation through this morning. And it's a book written by one of the greatest Canadian physicists, Neil Turok. Has anyone ever heard of him, Neil Turok? And he wrote a book called The Universe Within. And it is a beautiful exploration of our understandings of physics, but connecting it with our understandings of ourselves. This is something we're going to come back to more. So as you can see, symmetry is manifested and experienced in many different spaces of existence, the laws of nature, but also of human action, interaction, and creativity. We have it in architecture, we have it in religious symbols, we have it in chemistry, in music, in social interactions, and even in aesthetics. This was something that was new for me to discover. There are people who are working on what they call the law of attraction, why we find symmetrical features to be more attractive. And there's this computer program, it seems, where you can take your face or any face and it will replicate perfect symmetry if you had the left side replicated, if you had the right side replicated. And I can honestly say I only knew who one of these three people was when I was looking through all of these. What I found interesting, and it could just be me, but in every single case to me, it was the original asymmetric which was most attractive. The actual having some difference, which is what makes up the character of a person's face. Who knows who this is? Pardon? No, although she was also extraordinary. I'm hoping, I have a few colleagues from our institute here, and I'm hoping that everyone knows, because I have to say, to my incredible shame, and also probably to the shame of the society I grew up in my educational system, I only discovered who this incredible human being is several months ago. And that just astonished me. Because this is someone that I should have known of my entire life. The same way when I put up the picture of Einstein, we all know who Einstein was. I can show that picture. I have shown that picture in at least 60 different countries. And no matter where I am in the world, people know Albert Einstein. Well, Emmy Noether was the person that Einstein said was probably the greatest mathematician alive. Emmy Noether was one of the thinkers that inspired Einstein and many others and made some of the most important contributions in the history of human thought and existence to our understanding of the universe. And we don't even know her name. At the time she did this, it was interesting. By the time she was 18, she was already fluent in 3 languages, had certificates to teach in 2 of them in addition to her own. But she wasn't allowed to be admitted to university. She wasn't allowed to, once she did finally get in, she wasn't allowed to teach at universities. Once she was finally allowed to teach, she wasn't paid for being taught or for teaching at the university. And then when she finally found a position in an institution where she was able to practice and to bring forward her knowledge and experience, do you know what happened? The Nazis took power in her country, and because she was Jewish, she had to leave that too. And then she came over to the United States. She taught sometimes at Princeton, also another university. And it was Emmy Noether who discovered one of the single most important laws of physics and the natural world, and that is that every law of symmetry has a corresponding law of conservation. Now, if I'd said that sentence to myself 2 weeks ago, I'd have no idea what I just said. And I'm still working on it, so I should also say this is a work in progress, all of what I'm discussing here. But basically, this is her theorem, so this should explain it. Now we all understand, and we can go on. I loved, as I was looking at this, one of the physicists who was speaking on a video was saying that the normal reaction of any human being when they see these mathematical equations, you experience like almost a sense of intimidation, fright, can I flee? This is another version of it. Symmetries have corresponding laws of conservation. So what does that mean? Momentum is conserved, energy is conserved. Whatever you shift, the invariance that is fundamental to symmetry, that it fundamentally doesn't change, means that there is a conservation of law that goes together with that invariance. You can take these particles, you can move them to another location, but the total momentum between the particles remains the same. You can take a planet or an apple around a planet, and anywhere on rotational symmetry that apple circles around the planet, the momentum, the energy will be the same in terms of the gravitational pull, as long as there's no other planet in there to interfere. If I take a tennis ball, I really should have brought props. If I take a tennis ball and I'm holding it in my hand, there is a total energy. There's the potential energy, because now it's in my hand, it hasn't dropped, so it's purely potential, just like what a lot of us hold inside. And then you drop it, and there's kinetic energy, movement. And the faster or the further it drops, the faster it goes, so it's more kinetic energy, less potential. But the total energy always remains the same. So for spatial translation, you have conservation of momentum. For time translation, energy. Rotational translation, angular momentum. And then also in quantum mechanical, you have the conservation of energy, of charge. This is why we can do this. Because of the symmetry in the wheels, it conserves its shape, its form, its momentum and energy as it moves, so you don't have a wheel that suddenly goes squash as you're just traveling down a mountain, and that would not be good. Okay, moving on, because I only have a few minutes left. For me, when I was thinking about all of this and about symmetry, I was also connecting it with our lives. And a book that I read years ago that probably many of us have heard of now because it's become very, very popular, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote Flow. Have you heard this book? Okay. So in Flow, basic idea is he's interviewing, he's speaking with thousands of people who do everything from piano to chemistry to arts. And he's asking, what does it feel like when you are doing what you love? When you are in that moment where all of your skill, all your experience, and all of your passion come together. And there are different words. Some people said timelessness. You're in it, you don't even notice the passage of time. You are in that moment with the full presence of your being. And one of the things that I connected and I loved with that is that in those moments, and you can think of ballet as one example, behind that moment which appears as total grace that takes your breath away when you're seeing it, which is what, interestingly enough, symmetry and the laws of physics and nature did for me as I was diving into this. There are tens of thousands of hours of practice to achieve that flow, that moment of grace in what you're doing. Comes that love, that discipline, that constant building. And Mihai says in any field, to reach that point, and this is one of the basic understandings within the field of looking at creativity and creativity sciences, you need at least 10 years of really building up, internalizing, understanding. Of course, there's outliers, there's people who do that in 2, but for most, to have that intimate engagement and understanding with a field, it takes time to build that up. So, of course, if you're going to show Nadal, you have to show Federer. Another example, one of the greatest athletes in any field. Does anyone know this person? Yo-Yo Ma. Yeah. Yo-Yo Ma just astonishes me. I had the opportunity to hear him perform in Bucharest years ago at the UNESCO Festival with the Silk Road Band. For 3 hours, they just jammed, no sheet music. And you had goosebumps. This is him today. And you can see the ecstasy, the passion, the total being and presence in what he's doing. Or one of the greatest chess players in the world, Magnus from Norway. And it's this idea of finding, almost like the laws of synergy and conservation, this space, because when you're in flow, at least from my own experience, because fortunately that's what I've been living, definitely not all the time, but for a lot of the last 30 plus years, you don't use energy. I do programs all the time where people at the end of it say, you must be exhausted, and I feel fresh and ready to keep going and start. Because when you are in that space doing what you love, it is invariant. You are not using energy. You are literally being filled with it. It is remaining constant. It's that trick of how to find that space, that combination where your skill and challenge, but also where your passion and what is the expression of what comes from inside of you, you're able to do it in that moment. And there's 7 conditions: completely involved in what you're doing, focused, a sense of ecstasy, inner clarity, knowing that the activity is doable, a sense of serenity, timelessness, and intrinsic motivation. What you are doing becomes its own reward. First thought that came into my head when I read that was that it's describing making love. In our world today, we are out of symmetry. And I'm going to end with these 2 things because I know I'm probably already way over time. My apologies for that. This is a recent demonstration in Budapest. This is not from 70 years ago. This is from the States. This is from an area between Iraq and Syria. These are scouts. Czechetash? Ça se peut correct in Romania? Da. Is this like the Czechetash program you know from Cluj? No, this was developed by Homeland Security to train scouts in counterterrorism. This is part of the world that we are in today, with incredible poverty and inequality. This is just outside Cluj, where 8 people have more wealth than half of the world's population put together. This is a picture from the World Economic Forum, their global risk analysis they do every single year, looking at the major challenges and issues that are facing us. So since we have to bring it together, and we only have a few moments left and want to open up the space for discussion, just 2 thoughts that I want to share. On the one hand, we are in a world which is very much out of symmetry. Our energy is not being used to its optimum. We are facing major challenges and crisis in our social, political, economic systems that at the moment our current ways of doing things don't solve them. So we need to bring that incredible practice that scientists brought to discovering symmetry and the laws of physics, that application of deep thinking, that applied practice, that being sensitive to understanding what is out there, and to use the incredible knowledge and intelligence we have in this room and that we have as a species to solving these issues. So that's 1. 2, about our own lives. For me, the more I studied symmetry, the more I connected it with ourselves, with our relationships. When you fall in love, you have lots of asymmetrical moments in that experience. It's not all perfect and wonderful. You face challenges to who you are, how you are in your relationship. But like symmetry, when you really have that incredible connection and that deep love with someone, then no matter what conditions change around you, as you go through life, as you go through work, as you have children, as you have other things, no matter what time transforms, your love will grow, you will grow, your relationship will evolve, but at the core, it stays there, invariant. To me, that's breathtaking. There's very little in the actual world that is absolutely symmetrical other than our mathematical concepts, our ideas that help us make sense of and understand. It's because it is so rare in some ways that it's so breathtaking and beautiful. Just like life. I was going to end on that, but I had to share this. This was what was waiting for me when I got home yesterday. It was one of our two boys, Aaron, put this together. He said, "Be my Valentine," to Daddy. And I loved it because he didn't know I was giving a talk on symmetry today. But you can see the almost perfect symmetry of his hearts, the wings, and a bee does have symmetry. Thank you.